Welcome to Wealth Roadmap with Jeff and Steve, your guide to simplifying wealth management. Join us as we explore financial planning, taxes, investments, insurance, and legal frameworks to help you secure your financial future. Hello, everyone. My name is Jeff Costello. I'm here with Steve and Benny. Welcome to episode 3 of Wealth Roadmap with Jeff and Steve. Episode 3, 3 episodes in, and we have some good consistency going here. For the third episode, I'm starting it off, and for the third episode in a row, Steve Benny has been late for us recording our podcast.
That's not true, actually.
It's very much true. But anyway, we're here, and we have a great episode to talk about today. We're going to talk about sequence of return risk. But before I dive in, Steve wanted to bring on some icebreakers, so I'll turn it over to Steve.
Yeah. That's all right. Let's just take a step back for a second. Super Bowl this weekend, right?
Super Bowl, yes.
You have a big party coming up?
I do.
All right, listen to this real quick. I thought this was pretty ridiculous, but how much money? You remember when we were younger? It was like per commercial. I remember it was like $1 million. You ever hear that? Like it was $1 million per minute.
Yeah.
How much do you think it is right now?
Well, with inflation, Steve, I'm gonna guess it's gonna be up to $12 million for 1 minute commercial.
That's very close. But here's the thing: you said something with inflation. It's 14 million for one minute. Okay, $14 million. But in the time when we've seen inflation happen, guess how much it was last year? $14 million. No inflation with Super Bowl. So yeah, pretty wild, right? So yeah, so $14 million just for 1 minute, 30 seconds is $7 million. Do the quick math, that was just half. So here we are. All right, anyway.
That was the icebreaker that we had, ladies and gentlemen. Yeah, so that's why Steve's not hosting late night.
Oh, wait.
He's got this Wealth Roadmap podcast. We're going to dive into sequence and return risk.
Hold on. One last thing, actually. I wonder, how much for a ticket? What's the average price?
$9,000.
Damn, pretty good. $98.50. All right, let's jump into it.
All right. Sequence of return risk has nothing to do with Super Bowl, has nothing to do with football or any other great icebreakers that Steve and Benny may have. Sequence of return risk is really just bad market timing, right? So I don't know if there's a true definition, or Steve, if you want to give a true definition.
No, I think that was it. It's the order of returns that you have to look at, and you'll get into it, but we can't predict what the market is. Sequence of returns is ultimately understanding that, especially when you start pulling money out of a retirement account, it's not about the average return. It's about when the returns occur, the order of those returns. Of those returns, super important. So go for it.
Yeah, and whenever I'm talking to clients about this, I always bring up 2008. In terms of like the market crash at that time. COVID is tough because COVID, everything crashed and then came back so quickly. Even the recent bear market that we were in, a little bit shorter. But I mean, when you're going into, or when you think back to, let's say 2008, if you're listening to this and you saw whether it was your portfolio take a huge hit, your parents' portfolio take a huge hit, think about what the people were thinking when they retired a few months prior to that market crash, right? They were probably excited to go into retirement, had all their trips planned, life was exciting, and then boom, they just got a huge hit to their portfolio. Maybe they lost 20, 30, 40%. And now they're not feeling so good about taking money out of their portfolio to go on that trip that they planned. And that's basically sequence of return risk. And while it's a really big risk to pre-retirees or retirees, it could happen to anyone, right? Think about if you have a child going to college. and right before they're in their senior year of high school, and their entire college fund loses 30 or 40% right before they go into college. That's sequence of return risk. It's poor planning. And so today, Steve and I are going to kind of dive into how sequence of return risk affects, more specifically pre-retirees and retirees. But again, this subject can go into someone, sending their kid off to college, or even someone saving for a house, right? You don't want to put, again, your down payment, into the stock market, and then again, it lose 30 or 40% when you need it the most. So sequence of return risk, like Steve mentioned, isn't so much about the total return you get over a period of time. It's when those returns happen, and if those negative returns are going to happen early on in your portfolio. So let's dive into it. So we're going to do some quick math, and so if you're listening or you're watching, you got to try to visualize this with us. But let's pretend you have $1 million, Steve, right? Let's pretend you have $1 million in your retirement account, and boom, you lose 30%. How much money do you have in your portfolio?
$700,000.
You're right, Steve. Fun fact: both of Steve's teachers or parents were math teachers, so Steve is really quick with the math questions. So we just went from $1 million right down to 700,000. We lost 30%. Now, if I were to ask you, Steve, how much do we need to get back to square one?
Well, if I lost 30%, I don't know, Jeff. What would it be?
If Steve's parents weren't math teachers, he might say, "Oh, well, Jeff, I just need a 30% return." But that's not true, right? Because 30% of 700,000 is only 210,000.
Jeff, hold on. Yeah, mom, yeah, no, don't worry. I got the math question right. Okay, bye. Yeah, mom was just watching. We're live, everybody.
Making his mom proud since the 80s, folks. So if we had that 30%, if we had that 700,000, right? Again, we lose 30% from $1 million. Now we're down to 700,000. We get a 30% return. Now we're only up to 910,000. So what do we really need? We need more than we actually lost, right? We actually need a 43% return. So if I have 700,000 to get me back to just where I started, I need a 43% return. And maybe that's going to take a year, maybe 2 years, right? Depending on, what the markets are doing. Now, what happens if it's a greater loss? What if we lost 50%? Well, again, that $1 million is going to drop down to 500,000. Now, again, we need a bigger return. How big? Well, I need 100% return on my $500,000 portfolio just to get back to $1 million. Now, that's not a big problem if I'm in my 30s, 40s, or maybe lower 50s, and I'm still saving for retirement. But if that happens right before I go into retirement, that doesn't really give me much of a runway to get back to square one, especially if I plan on drawing down on these assets. So, Steve, talk to us about, if I'm in that situation, or again, I'm running into retirement and I have a poor year, even if it's not a 50% loss, but even something just more a smaller loss. How does that affect someone's portfolio? Or talk to us through that.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Because, well, a couple things. One, what you mentioned, Jeff, that's not even pulling money out. That's just saying, hey, if we have a loss, what do we have to get back to even without pulling money out? Obviously, if you're pulling money out, now that that 50% loss, like you mentioned, Jeff, or whatever, or that 30% loss, you're actually, if you pull out 5%, you're actually losing 35% or 55%. So that number, to get back to even, you have to earn more than you would. So that's why we were mentioning, earlier, when with sequence of returns risk, it's really a risk that we say is unique to retirees, but really it's a risk unique to anyone who's pulling money out of a portfolio that's invested. Like Jeff mentioned, whether it's maybe you have kids that are going to college, and all of a sudden the 529 account gets hit, but with a bad market or a negative market. Well, guess what? If you pull money out when the market's down, you're going to run into this. Or let's say you need a new roof or a new car, something happens and the markets are down. What happens? Well, you're gonna have to pull and take money from your account, so from your investment accounts. And if markets are down, you run into sequence of returns risk. So, it's really whether you're looking to retire or really just in general. And this goes back to the philosophy that we do believe in is segmentation of your money. And we'll save that for another episode. But the bottom line is you want to segment your money to make sure that you have some money so you can protect against this risk in whatever life cycle or money cycle phase that you're in. So just if you look at, I'll just go through another quick example, very similar to what Jeff mentioned, right? If I'll use different negative returns. So 3 examples. If you have a negative 10% return, what do you have to get back to even? Right, it's not 10, it's 11, right? So if you're down 10, you need 11% to get back to even. But what if you were to introduce, withdrawing 5% on top of that initial loss of 10%, and you withdraw that 5% for the next 5 years so you lose 10%, you're withdrawing 5%. Yeah, we're not assuming investment returns right now. We're not illustrating that. We're just illustrating what it would take to get back to even over that period of time, that 5-year period of time. You need a 44% growth just to get back to even. Let's look at 20%, right? If the market is down 20%, what would you have to do just the next year to get back to even? 25%. Okay, but now let's introduce taking 5% withdrawals from that over a 5-year period. So you're down 20%, you're taking 5% out, 5-year period. To get back to even, you need a return of 62%, right? So you can see the impact by having that loss, but now compounding that with distributions or taking money out exacerbates the issue and causes the portfolio to have to work harder, right? You have less dollars that now have to work harder, and so it has to earn a higher return. These are all hypotheticals as far as these numbers that I'm sharing, but the math is not. The math is math. Negative 30%, Jeff mentioned that earlier. What do we have to do to get back to even? 43%. What happens when you take 5% out? You lose 30%, and you start taking 5% out for the 5 years. You need an 85% return with distributions from that. So it's something to be aware of, because like I mentioned, it's your money is working harder. It's like trying to bail out water from a leaking boat. You're not able to ever get back out of it because you're distributing. You're not accumulating. You're not putting money into it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mentioned before, how someone maybe sending their child to college could run into sequence of return risk. But the difference there, Steve, is that if my daughter is going to college and I take a hit on her 529 or her college fund, I could take out a loan, right? I could say, oh, you know what? I'll let this account rebound. I can't do that in retirement, right? I can't take out a retirement loan. The only thing I could do is say, oh, now I have to wait 5 or 6 or 7 years to delay retirement, and no one obviously wants to do that. And so that's why sequence return risk really is a true risk for that's more for pre-retirees or retirees. And this is something that really hasn't had to been talked about for such a long time, because years ago there were pensions, and when someone had a pension, they didn't have to worry about this, right? They knew money was going to hit their bank account every month. But as the 401k plan or as savings have been pushed, that responsibility has been pushed on to us as individuals. Now this risk is becoming more and more prevalent, where, if I'm going into retirement, I have a few $1,000,000 and I have no other income sources, I have to draw down on my money. That's where, again, Steve's talking about, again, if we lose 30%, 43%, I need to get back to square one, but not if I'm drawing down on money, right? And I have to take out that, 5% to be able to send me to Europe, or me take the grandkids to Disney, or whatever it might be that I want to do in retirement. So that's why it's, again, so important to kind of plan for this. And I think another episode that we can kind of talk about is, like Steve, you're talking about us withdrawing, 5% out of our portfolio. There's that 4% rule, but even the 4% rule has been getting, drilled down to lower numbers with everything going on.
Yeah, and even if you used 4%, you have $1 million portfolio. That's $40,000. And you have a what, close to 99%, 98, whatever the number is, right? But it's a high chance of not running out of money. You're not guaranteed, but there's a high chance that you won't. But at 4% on $1 million, $40,000. Maybe you have a little pension, Social Security, but then that $1 million is held hostage, right? Because the second that you need more money, or if you need to adjust that for inflation, right, at 4%, it's really saying, hey, you have $1 million, 4%, you're getting $40,000. You could get that over a 30-year period. That's about a 98%-ish, give or take, chance of not running out of money. But over a 30-year period, what could happen? Well, inflation could happen. We know that. What else could happen? Well, life could kind of happen. You might need more. What happens if you, again, there's an emergency, or you have something that you want to plan for and you need extra money? If you either take more than 40,000 and increase that percentage, you're either going to drastically really increase the risk of running out of money, right? If you, for every kind of percentage that you go up, or if you eat into the $1 million, hey, I need an extra 50,000. Well, now you have 950.
Yeah.
Right? We're not assuming returns. We're just kind of illustrating a point. Well, now 4% of 950 isn't 40,000 anymore. And if you continue to take 40,000 off 950, what have you done? You've increased your withdrawal rate, which now increases your chance of running out of money. So it is a rule that that planners have followed or have written about, but in practice, from a standpoint of it, look, everyone is different, but and every situation is different, but there could be a more efficient way to have a tax efficient drawdown strategy.
Yeah, and I think, like you mentioned, the numbers are the numbers, right? But the one thing that no one is sure of is when they retire, what the market is going to look like at that time, right? No one knows whether, going into retirement, the first few years are going to be good or going to be bad. So we're going to run through a quick example. So with regards to losing money early on versus later on in life, when we have assets, a lot of times what we'll hear is, you know what, Jeff, Steve, with where I'm at, I'm not gonna, I don't have to worry about if the market's gonna lose or if it's gonna be better. I'll just live off the interest, right? We hear that quite a bit, but the problem with that is that no one knows. Again, you might have an average return of 6%, of 7%, or whatever the numbers are. Wait 1 second. Why isn't this working? All right, so
yeah, I could see it.
So we have a quick, for those of you watching the podcast, we have a quick chart up. We're going to try our best to explain this over the podcast. So we have one example. We're going to call her Mrs. Happy, and we have another example of Mr. Happy. So what we basically did is showing a 10-year time frame where the average return over that 10-year period was 6%. Now the difference is that Miss Happy is getting her first year, she's getting a 30% return, and then she's getting a 20% return, followed by 6 years of consecutive 10% positive returns, and then in year 9 losing 20%, and then in year 10 losing 30%. Now in this example, we have her having $100,000. So in her first year, where she gets a 30% return, her account grows to $130,000.
Jeff, and did we mention that this is the accumulation phase, right?
Yeah, and this is the accumulation phase, right? So we're not taking any money out. So her $130,000 gets a 20% return in year 2, grows to $156,000, and then again followed by a few good 10 years, And around year 8, she peaks at 276, but then, like I mentioned, in years 9 and 10, she loses 20% and then 30%. But at the end of 10 years, her $100,000 portfolio has grown to 154,000. Now, again, she had a few really good years in the beginning, pretty good years in the middle, and then 2 bad years at the end, and she ended with 154. And again, she wasn't touching this money, right? She's in the accumulation cycle of her life. Mr. Unhappy, a little bit different scenario. For him, instead of him having 2 great years in the beginning, we just inversed the returns. So he's going to have poor returns in the first 2 years, and then really good returns in the last 2 years. So he starts with 100,000, but he loses 30% in year 1, bringing his investment down to 70,000. And then he loses 20%, bringing it all the way down to 56,000 in year 2. But again, Mr. Unhappy, he is not spending this money. And then the next 8 years are followed by 10%, 10%, 10%. And then years 9 and 10, 20 and 30%. And he gets to the same $154,000 number that Miss Happy. Now, their paths to get to that year 10 were a lot different. But nonetheless, they ended at 154. They averaged roughly a 6% return to get there.
So
Go ahead.
So it's an average return of 6%, right, for both of them. But each year, what we're showing is for each Miss Happy, Mr. Unhappy, they're in their accumulation phase, right? So they're working, they're saving, they're not relying on their assets for money because they have an income. And so what's happening here, though, is each year the return is different, but the average is 6%. So at the end of the year, both have the same amount of money. Yes, the path to which they got to that amount of money is different, completely different, but doesn't really matter because they're working, they're not relying on it, and they're just saving, right? That's what we have
exactly.
There. Okay.
Yeah. Now, it's a lot different, Steve, right? When we go into distribution, where all of a sudden we say, hey, you know what? This is what your portfolio is going to look like in your first, few years of retirement. And, the reason why we're going to pull out, let's say, 6% return here is because, again, people say, oh, I'll live off the interest. And again, we know that, there's going to be some good years in the market, some bad years. But if we live off the interest, this is essentially what happens. Well, Miss Happy, again, she starts with that same 100,000. She gets that same 30% return that we talked about before, so it grows to 130. But she's retired now, right? She needs income to pay her groceries, pay her mortgage, do the thing that she wants to do. So let's pretend she takes out $6,000. Well, now her $130,000 is down to 124. Now that 124, if you recall, gets a 20% return in year 2. So that's going to grow to a 148. But again, she takes out another 6,000. So now it's down to 142. And she continues to do this, right? As she's, her assets are growing. She's taking out $6,000 each and every year, regardless of what the market does. And if you recall, in years 9, she loses 20%. And in years 10, she lost 30%. So at that point, at the end of year 10, her portfolio has now dropped to 105,000. But remember, she started only with 100,000. So she started with 100,000, took out $6,000 a year for 10 years. So she took out 60 grand, and she has 105. So she has more than she started with. So it's not a terrible position to be in.
So Miss Happy, she enters retirement. What you're saying here, Jeff, is she enters retirement, and she ends up having a couple good years in her early years in retirement. A few good years in her early years in retirement. But then towards the end, she has a couple pretty bad years. But she started with 100,000, she took out 6,000, and she has an average return of 6%. But even though she had those couple pretty bad years towards the end of that 10-year time period in years 9 and 10, she still has more than she started with. She has $105,544, and she was taking out $6,000 a year as well for 10 years. Okay.
Correct. Yeah. And again, she peaks at one point. She peaked at having close to 200,000 around year 8. But
Yep.
again, obviously with her losing 20 and 30% and also taking out money, right? It
Dropped
brought her
pretty
account
significantly.
down to
Yeah.
105.
But
Now,
she did good, right?
yeah. Now again,
Yeah.
no one can control. Yeah,
Right.
she put in 100,000. She at the end of 10 years, she was able to pay all of her bills and she still has more than what she put in. But um, but yeah, no one can control. Like I wish I can go to every one of my clients and say, hey, your first 8 years of retirement are going to be great. We have nothing to worry about, right? But we don't know that. And so it's always best to kind of prepare for the worst and hope for the best, right? Um, Mr. Unhappy had unfortunately different luck. So again, he starts with the same 100,000, and if you recall, his portfolio in terms of his order of returns are just reversed. So instead of him having the -30 and -20% at the back end, he has them in the front end. So when he starts off with 100,000, Steve, and he loses 30%, that brings him down to 70,000, right? And then
I see
he
that.
takes out $6,000, and so now he's down to $64,000. And so now when he loses 20% off of that, and it brings it down to roughly 51,000, and then he takes another 6,000 out. At the end of his second year, he's down to $45,000. And again, he's only 2 years in. So the next few years, or even just the next year, if we just talk hypothetically, he has 45,000. Even if he gets a 10% return next year, he's only going to be making $4,500 in return, and he's taking out 6,000. So, he's kind of lighting the candle at both ends. So even with these 10% returns over these next 8 years, or next 6 years, by the end of year 8, he's down to 33,000. And so even when he gets a nice 20% return in year 9 and then a 30% return in year 10, by the end of the 10th year, he's at 38,000.
Wow.
So he took out the same 60,000 that Miss Happy did, right? They both started with the same 100,000, except one person has $105,000 left over, another person has $38,000 left over,
So
and that has nothing to do with.
go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna say that just has nothing to do with, the average return. It depends on when those returns happen, and so losing, having again the candle lit at both ends in the first few years for Mr. Unhappy, crushed his portfolio, and he was never able to, recover. Kind of similar to like the numbers that you talked about earlier, where, again, if we're losing, even 20% returns, we need a big number just to get back to square one.
Exactly. And so, right, like they both have the same average return. I mean, this I'm staring at it, the example is a 6% average return, but average isn't actual. And that's where when you're taking money out, if we just said, hey, who would you rather be, Miss Happy or Mr. Unhappy? And we just said they both have an average return of 6%. You probably look at us like, what do you mean? It doesn't matter. But then when we show you these two examples and you can see the difference in the amount of money that they have at the end of that 10-year period, both have the same average return, but the order of those returns are different. And they're pulling money out. And so that is really when you start to enter that preservation phase of what we call the money cycle. And when we say the money cycle, we talk 3 phases. You have the accumulation phase, preservation phase, and distribution phase. When the accumulation phase, we just went over that example, right? That's when you're working, you're saving. But then 5 to 10 years away from retirement, you start to get into what we call that preservation phase. And, it's really when you want to start to preserve a portion of your money to be able to prepare yourself or get yourself ready for the distribution phase. And that's distribution to yourselves and also to your heirs, upon your passing. And you want to make sure that you have a proper plan that can address this risk, that can eliminate or mitigate this risk, because this is one piece that could end up, eroding the money that you have faster than you originally thought. And not necessarily saying that you're going to run out of money, okay, but could leave you with a lot less than what you originally thought, and then could kind of become a bit of an issue as time goes, especially if you have other plans that you want to fulfill, or um, in retirement, whatever that may be. But it's a good example, and Jeff, that was a good one to explain as far as the impact that sequence of returns has on that distribution phase. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, you can't control when you're going to retire, but you can plan for, again, worst case scenario. So, in situations like this, it's having a plan in place so that, hey, if, Steve, if I'm going into retirement and in, years 2 and 3, we run into the dot-com bubble, right? Where,
Yeah.
it's not like we lost 34 or 40% in 1 year, but, it was consistent, like -10, 15, and then I think 13%, something like that, back to back to back. And so if we retired at that point, and again, the 90s was a great run, and if all of a sudden, again, we're running into the dot-com bubble where it's just negative, negative, negative 3 years in a row, we're going to run into that sequence of return risk. So it's about really having a plan so that if that does happen, you're not foregoing your retirement plans, right? Your bucket list trip. Because, we talk about it all the time in retirement, right? You have the go-go years, the slow go years, and then the no go years, right? So the time that you want to be traveling is early on in retirement, and you don't want to, put that on the back burner because you didn't plan properly. So we'll probably get into this on another podcast episode on ways to plan for not running into sequence of return risk. And like Steve mentioned, we believe in, time segmenting your assets so that, again, you have a portion of your money kind of allocated for your first, 5 to 10 years of, let's say, retirement that's not going to run into the volatility that we've kind of been talking about.
Yep.
So again, with sequence of return risk, it's really, about, not so much the total return that you're getting over a period of time, it's the order of those returns. So any last Super Bowl questions, sequence of return risk comments to the co-host?
So nothing for the Super Bowl. That's all I had in the beginning. But as far as just some last words. Just remember, average when you're taking money out, the average rate of return is really meaningless. It's the order or the sequence of returns that's far more important. And like you mentioned earlier, Jeff, you don't know what the next 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 years returns are going to be in the market. Like you just don't know. It's the luck of the draw. So
yeah,
have a plan, protect against it. Make sure you're aware of it. That's the biggest thing. Just make sure you understand it, and when you're sitting down and planning, in whatever stage of that money cycle that you're in, make sure you protect against this. That's that.
Yeah,
And save some money for those Super Bowl tickets, because $10,000 is a pricey thing to pay.
Yeah, it's and especially to pull that $10,000 out of your portfolio that finally recovered after this recent market. Yeah, I mean, it's not guaranteed that you're gonna retire and everything is gonna be sunshine and rainbows, right? Your first few years of retirement, right? What do they say? There's 3 guarantees in life, right? Death, taxes, and Steve being late to record a podcast. Ladies and gentlemen, that wraps us up for episode 3. Please subscribe, like, comment, send us in any other topics you would like for us to talk about. Otherwise, have a plan for sequence of return risk, and we'll see you on the next episode.
All right, everybody. We appreciate you all. Thanks, Jeff. Good stuff.
All right, take it easy, guys.
Thank you for joining us. If you enjoyed our podcast, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment on topics you'd like for us to cover on future episodes. We'll see you soon.
Financial planning and advisory services are offered through Prosperity Capital Advisors, PCA, an SEC-registered investment advisor with its principal place of business in the state of Ohio. One Team Financial LLC and PCA are separate, non-affiliated entities. PCA does not provide tax or legal advice. Insurance and tax services offered through One Team Financial LLC are not affiliated with PCA. Information received from this video should not be viewed as individual investment advice. Product discussions and illustrations are hypothetical in nature and will vary based on many factors, including but not limited to age, health, product, insurance carrier, and product design. You should consult the insurance carrier website and policy for detailed information. Content may have been created by a third party and was not written or created by a PCA-affiliated advisor and does not represent the views and opinions of PCA or its subsidiaries. For information pertaining to the registration status of PCA, please contact the firm or refer to the Investment Advisor Public Disclosure website. For additional information about PCA, including fees and services, send for our disclosure statement as set forth on Form ADV from PCA using the contact information herein. Please read the disclosure statement carefully before you invest or send money.